Hello and welcome to another episode of All the Things. I am Monique Dusan. Now, if you are with us every week, I am sure you notice that I am in our office studio and my partner in crime, Krista, is not here with me today, but we still have an awesome show to talk about. I am excited to talk about this show in particular because I think it's something that I'm seeing happening or being talked about in many secular circles. And so I wanted to bring, and Chris also wanted to bring a more biblical idea and a more biblical approach to our conversation. But before we get started, I want to say a big shout out to our moderators. Thank you so much for keeping the peace in the comments. And hello to the family and the ATT choir, the altos and the sopranos. Stay warmed up. You guys, today we are talking about the fall of civilization. Is society falling? Are we watching the signs that we might be in a civilization? And when I say civilization, I'm primarily talking about the West that is in either significant decline or is falling and on the brink of collapse. I recently read an article in a Psychology Today magazine, and I'm going to read that before I bring on our guest, Dr. Sunshine, so that we can all kind of be just caught up on why we want to approach this topic. And in the article, it says, it has become increasingly clear that we are living in a very fragile, extremely polarized, and highly unstable world. In this regard, it looks like Western civilization, particularly, is suffering from a kind of instability known as enemy, a complex meaning for lawlessness or lawless. In practical terms, anomie is a societal condition that stems from a sense of lawlessness, a lack of moral standards and values, and a lack of meaning. Anomie results in the fragmentation of social identity, the rejection of self-regulatory values, and the breakdown of social order. Mounting evidence pointing to the breakdown of social order across Europe and North America can be gleaned from various media reports. Increases in criminal behavior, including both random and non-random acts of violence against others, looting, robbery, break-ins, carjackings, defacing and destroying public and private property, etc., have reached near epidemic levels in the United States. To be sure, such acts of lawlessness are alarming and, if not curbed, don't bode well for the future of a nation that paradoxically was founded on the rule of law. Even if Western society has not completely fallen, it does appear to be undergoing what can be described as a downward slide toward anomie. Put differently, it is falling into a state of normlessness and lawlessness that begs serious attention before it potentially reaches a point of no return. The breakdown of social order appears to be fueled by, or at least is associated with, a number of perceived and real drivers: illegal and uncontrolled immigration, pluralist pushback against what is considered to be globalist tyranny, and the psychology of totalitarianism. Escalating conflicts associated with so-called identity politics based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender, etc., stark increases in income inequality, and growing feelings of disconnection from others and the wider world that are often accompanied by personal struggles with loneliness and related psychological issues. So they're listing out, what they're seeing in society, the lawlessness and the normlessness, and they're blaming it on things like loneliness or the psychology of totalitarianism, escalating conflicts associated with identity politics and things like that. And while we're not going to drive down into the identity politics side of things, I do believe that the scriptures actually have something to say about normlessness and lawlessness and the decline of society and things like that. And there's a way that the church can actually speak into some of these things. We've seen it in history. And so today, my guest is Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I first met Dr. Glenn Sunshine and Mrs. Sunshine, who was absolutely delightful, at a Colson Center event where we both spoke. And I knew right at that moment, you know what? these are good people. And so, Dr. Sunshine, thank you so much for joining me and having this conversation. I know that you are a historian, and I first became acquainted with your work in your book, Why You Think the Way You Do. You guys, if you haven't read that book, you need to read that. It literally just opened your mind to so many things like, oh, this has been around for hundreds of years. But thank you for joining me. Please tell our audience a bit about yourself.
Well, thank you for having me. By way of background, I am a historian. My major work was in Renaissance and Reformation Europe, did a lot with medieval Europe as well. I was a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University for 27 years. Before that, 2 years at Calvin College. I retired a few years ago, and now I work with the Colson Center, with Reflections Ministries, and I have my own ministry as well, Every Square Inch Ministries. Um, I'm a podcaster with the Theology podcast, and I do a bunch of other things as well.
Wow, you do a lot of other things as well. And before we go, we'll make sure to put up your website and everything like that so people can stay connected to you. But let's jump into the conversation. We are talking about civilization and declines of civilization. Can you help us understand from a historical perspective and from a biblical perspective, how is a civilization defined? Like, what is a civilization?
Well, anthropologists really don't have a strict definition of civilization, but probably the best way of understanding it is a civilization happens when you have a society that has a relatively high level, and exactly what that means is up for grabs, but a high level of complexity in terms of its social, economic, and political organization. Um, the key here is, I would argue, there has to be a degree of common values. There can be a degree of diversity in culture, but for it to be a civilization, there has to be at least some sort of underlying set of beliefs and values that hold it together. And structurally, there's like I said, a relatively high degree of social organization, economic organization, those sorts of things. So you wouldn't normally talk about, for example, a hunter-gatherer tribe in New Guinea as being a civilization, at least not in the anthropological sense. It's a culture, it's a society, it's a number of other things, but civilization isn't a word that would be used for it. The word civilization actually comes from a Latin word meaning a city, and that by itself should cue you in that we're dealing with something that's relatively highly organized and integrated.
Awesome. So when we think about a civilization, we should think about a society with structures, maybe like an economic structure. They have maybe an educational structure. They have norms, rules, kind of mores, and things like that that all go in. But it would be different than like a hunter-gatherer tribe because maybe it's just more on a larger scale. It's more equipped, more defined. Am I on the right path?
Yeah, well, the hunter-gatherer society may be highly organized, but there's a level of complexity is really sort of the key word, because it is on a larger scale, and there is a higher degree of integration between all of these different things. It's going to operate really on a different scale than what you would see with a hunter-gatherer tribe or something like that. So again, the term is a bit slippery. And so anthropologists and sociologists and people who study these things are going to vary in terms of how exactly they define it. But that, I think, is a good working definition to go with here. The Bible,
So,
it's worth noting, doesn't talk about civilizations per se.
hmm.
So it's a little difficult to really, tease out what a biblical definition would be. And as a matter of fact, if you look in scripture, these highly organized societies tend not to be the ones you really like. The first one is going to be Babel. Then you see Egypt, those kinds of things. They're not necessarily the good guys.
Well, that leads me right into my next question. I'm so glad that you said that because when we think of society, or when I think of some of the first societies or civilizations, I think of ancient Egypt or I think of Mesopotamia. And so I've never really thought about like Babylon, and yeah, maybe they aren't the good guys. Um, but let's talk about some historical examples of civilization, or civilizations that have fallen and why they've fallen. Is it just the nature of civilizations that they rise and then ultimately they fall? Like, is that just something that we should expect when we think about civilization?
I think it is. C.S. Lewis in The Weight of Glory makes a really interesting comment. He says, it's in the context, he says, you've never met a mere mortal. He says, human beings, if I can paraphrase him, human beings are eternal.
Hmm.
He says, arts, civilizations, societies, these are all mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat.
Wow.
Everything that we see around us in human societies, civilizations, and all of those, they may last 1,000 years. They may last more than that. But ultimately, they come to an end. Human beings don't. We are destined for eternity.
Hmm.
All societies, everything we see around us is destined to come to an end. And I think all civilizations do as well. We know that that has been true historically. There's
Yeah.
never been a society that hasn't fallen. And I think we can expect ours to do that as well if Jesus tarries long enough. So,
So, go
to your
ahead.
next question, though, what are the signs of civilizational failure?
Yeah.
There are quite a number of them. There's a British anthropologist in the 1930s who was working really in response to Sigmund Freud. Freud argued in a book called Civilization and Its Discontents that civilization was really built around sublimating sexual desire. He
Hmm.
says, society has taboos on sexual behavior, and we have an intrinsic desire to do things that there are taboos against. So we can't do these things, so we channel that energy into the things that build society. So we've got good things that happen. We build civilization, but we do it at the expense of our own happiness. That's Freud's idea. Now, there's a British anthropologist by the name of Unwin who decided he wanted to explore this. And basically what he wanted to argue is, look, sexual behavior has nothing to do with civilization. And so he studied, I believe the number was 84 different societies to look at the relationship between sexual behavior and the society. And one of the things that he discovered was that he was wrong, that in fact, maintaining actually pretty stringent norms for sexual behavior was actually essential for civilizational survival. He says once you start releasing um, the standards for sexual behavior, once you start loosening restrictions around marriage, for example, that sexual behavior is not confined to marriage. Once you begin losing, for example, monogamy, once you begin doing any of these kinds of things, once your sexual mores are unmoored, if that is the case for 3 generations, civilizational collapse is inevitable.
Wow.
He says there is no exception to that. In all of these 80, like I said, I think it was 84 societies that he studied, without exception, every one of them collapsed once there were 3 generations of unmoored um, sexual restraint.
Well, I think that's very interesting, especially when we look at the way that our society is currently going, or when we look at some of the ways in which promiscuity was addressed in scripture, especially in the Old Testament, and how, there are societies that are not around today, but when we look back into their history, we can see that they had, deviant sexual, desires and pleasures and things like that. It's also very interesting that you talk about Freud and his book on sexuality and civilization. It also reminds me of thoughts that are also put forward by Frankfurt School thinker Herbert Marcuse in his book Eros and Civilization. And so I would have never known. Now, when you're looking
Yeah.
at a civilization And we see like, okay, so if for 3 generations there's like this idea of unmooring, our sexual mores, or we are beginning to go down this path of just like sexual deviance. I want to actually hone in on a specific society and see if that was part of their fall as well, or what went into their decline. And the civilization I want to look at is ancient Rome. So, were there warning signs that preceded the fall of Rome? And if there were, what were they? Did it include this idea of, this sexual deviance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. As a matter of fact, well, let's ask the question why that is the case. Okay, let's just start there. The key reason, it seems to me, is that one of the things that keeps a society going is marriage and children. And the reason for that is that when you get married, as a man particularly, and when you have children, it changes the way you think about yourself and it changes the way you think about the world. You begin living, and when this is the norm in society, you're no longer living for yourself in immediate gratification and your immediate self-interest. You're living for the next generation. You're living for the future. And this future orientation where you're channeling your energy, you're thinking about building for the future, is one of the key things that ends up preserving society. Whereas without this norm, that the expectation that you're going to be married, you're going to have kids, those kinds of things, without that as a solid norm, there are always exceptions, but without that as a sort of solid norm in society, you're living for the moment. And when you're living for the moment, there's nothing that leads you to live for the future, to build, to do things that are going to preserve the society and promote it and push it forward. That's the key problem in a lot of ways with unmoored sexuality. And we see that, in fact, today, in America, obviously. But you also see it in ancient Rome. You know, it turns out that when societies get very affluent, this is also an interesting connection here. When societies get really affluent, they tend to have fewer children. So the peak in affluence in a lot of ways in Rome, in terms of general affluence, was around 50 BC. And what you see happening is a declining birthlet rate in Rome in about that period. So much so that Augustus, Caesar, actually passed a law that tried to force Roman noblemen, particularly, to get married and have children. Because he was already seeing at that point this decline in Roman, in the Roman birth rate. And you also see, accompanying this within just a few generations, a decline in Roman values, in the norms and expectations that you see in Rome. You see a remarkable rise in decadence within just a few generations, most notably in the Caesars, but you also see it more broadly in society. Now, the roots of that go back earlier, but you're already seeing it in place there. And it's no accident that it doesn't happen immediately, but it's no accident that by the 3rd century, Rome is in a crisis. Now, Rome had a lot of institutions that managed to hold it together, that prevented it from collapsing right away. The Roman government and bureaucracy managed to hold together for a while, but it's really overall on a trajectory downward all through that period. And, there's a bit of a revival, but it never really recovers. And like I said, it continues this downward trajectory to the point where by the time you're in the late 300s, the Roman army isn't even Romans anymore. The Roman army, which was one of the key institutions in the Republic and the early empire, is almost entirely Germanic barbarian soldiers and mercenaries. And by the time you're in the 5th century, well, this is when Rome, especially in the West, really collapses because it's all being run by these Germanic tribes who eventually realize they don't really need Rome anymore anyway, and they take over.
Man.
It's a long trajectory down, but the roots you can see if you look at this. We talk about the Pax Romana and things like that, but you can see if you follow the trajectory of what's going on, you can see it on this trajectory downward. The peak is actually prior to the Pax Romana. The Pax Romana is living on borrowed time in a lot of ways.
Mm.
My time with BTS has been a time of theological excellence, but it's also been a time of learning practical personal ministry.
The things that I learned here at BTS, I have implemented them into my ministry.
I was not necessarily planning on getting a seminary degree. I just would choose Birmingham Theological Seminary classes that I was the most interested in, that I thought could help me develop the most. But I ended up getting my MDiv from BTS, and there's so much that I've learned.
I'm really, really indebted to BTS because without it, I don't think I could have gotten this far. I initially started it because I had been called to a church, had no theological education, but knew I needed it. So between having my first child, doing my first job, and having my first church, BTS came in and just sort of helped me to understand what it meant to be a qualified minister and to be a studied minister that could rightfully divide the word of truth.
There was something that you said right when you started talking about, and I wrote down affluence equals fewer children. And, I think that that is something that we can, well, one, my first question is going to be, why do you think that is? Why do you think that with affluence comes fewer children? And is that something that you can kind of mark in among Christians as well?
I have no idea what the reason is. It's an observation that that's how
Mhm.
things tend to go. And yeah, I think we see it among Christians as well, particularly as you look at the United States, because Christianity, the church, the state of the church, the state of Christians is always made up of two things. It's made up of the influence of culture and it's made up of the influence of scripture. And culture generally has got more influence than scripture does. So when you have an affluent society, the values of the affluent society tend to have an awful lot of impact on the way Christians actually live and the way they see the world. And when you have an affluent society that says 2 kids is absolutely the most and maybe even fewer, Christians tend to pick up those values.
Okay, y'all, this is why at CFBU we always say marry and have babies, live differently than the culture. We see this idea in Genesis. Like, this is a Genesis idea that you marry and you have babies. And that's not all that we do. We go out, we create culture. There are ways in which we worship God through our culture. There are so many things that we do. But when we read Genesis, we don't see this idea of follow the culture. We actually see an idea where we go out and we subdue, where we create culture. And part of that is marrying and having babies. It it has the potential to change the trajectory for culture. But I do agree with you very sadly that unfortunately the culture at times has much more influence than our scriptures. How do you think ideologies have historically played into the decline of a culture?
Okay, that's the second area that's worth looking at. I've got 4 or 5 of these
Oh, well,
that are
please let me step aside. I
that
will
are
sit
that
in the choir stand. Please preach and let us know.
yeah.
You can go through all 5.
The marks of civilizational decline. Well, one of them is what happens when a society ceases to believe in the fundamental set of values and norms that the society has always held. We see this fundamentally in Rome in a lot of ways, but the best example I really have is France prior to the revolution. If you look at someone like a Voltaire, Voltaire was a savage critic of everything having to do with French culture in the 18th century. Everything about it. Voltaire was just brutal in terms of his criticism of it. And he was very witty, he was very funny about it, and he was very popular. And he lived for a while in exile. Initially, he was exiled, but then he lived in voluntary exile for a long time, and he was writing and such. And toward the end of his life, he wrote a play that was going to premiere in Paris. And he returned to Paris for the premiere of this play. And he was treated, when he got back to Paris, he was treated as basically a hero. He was given sort of the equivalent of a ticker tape parade. He was feted. He was viewed as like I said, a cultural hero. And as I look at it, this is a good decade before the revolution. As I look at it, that was a sign to me that the revolution was inevitable. Because what it said is that the people had so internalized this Enlightenment critique of everything about their society that the society could no longer stand. The revolution was inevitable at that point. What form the revolution would take was up for grabs, but the revolution was inevitable. The society could no longer stand because the people had adopted an ideology that said that the existing system was hopelessly corrupt. It was impossibly, it was just simply impossible to fix. It needed to be completely torn down and rebuilt. So when you internalize a radical critique of the society to such an extent that you no longer believe in it, that is another sign of civilizational collapse. I think you see that in Rome. You emphatically see it in France prior to the revolution. I would argue that you see that in many ways in American culture as well right now. I've actually run into people who are making arguments like, the French Revolution was actually probably a really good idea, and maybe we need something like that now. We see in a recent poll, roughly half of the people that identify as Democrats believe that assassination of Trump or Musk is at least to some extent justified.
Sorry to interrupt you, but as I'm listening to you, I am just reminded of a conversation that I was having with students last week, where many of the students that I was talking to actually believed that some form of revolution in America was what was needed because our systems and structures are so broken that they are beyond repair. And I used to live in South Africa for a few years, and much of what I'm hearing in South Africa through some of their politicians is that they need a new constitution, that they need to break down the society of South Africa basically for a revolution, because the structures and systems are so impacted with corruption or quote unquote whiteness that these structures and systems are literally beyond repair. And so, yeah, as you're saying, people have internalized societal critique that society no longer can stand, or that society is beyond what is fixable, or I think your words were impossible to fix. That really resonates. I think we definitely can see that in America, in conversations in America, but also conversations abroad.
Yeah, I mean, I know you don't want to get into the identity politics thing here, but broadly, critical theory, which is way beyond just critical race theory, critical theory is a
Yes.
much broader category. Critical
Oh, we can
theory,
get into critical theory. Go ahead.
well,
I'm
critical
here for it.
theory at its root says that society is divided between oppressors and oppressed, and this is an inevitability. Society is always divided between oppressors and oppressed.
Yes.
And so what needs to happen is that all of the oppressed categories of people need to unite together to overthrow the systems of oppression, which fundamentally means you're going to replace one set of oppressors with another, because oppression is inevitable in society.
Exactly.
But what that basically says is that the system right now is rigged against them. It is fundamentally oppressive, and it is keeping the oppressor classes in power, which is a call for revolution.
Yeah.
That fundamentally it's what critical theory is.
Mhm.
So you see that, and critical theory has been embedded deeply in the educational system, in DEI programs and things like that. And, you know, it is an ideology that has been promoted, which is at its core, really at its root. They won't say this explicitly, but at its root, it's implicitly revolutionary.
Yes.
And it is this kind of deep-seated critique of society that, when internalized, leads really, frankly, directly to the kind of societal collapse that we saw in France.
Yes. But it slides under the banner of liberation through revolution.
Right.
Liberation for the oppressed through this idea of revolution. But I don't know how many people are actually putting the two and two together to understand that the revolution that people are talking about it's a complete societal revolution. It's not just this idea of critical race theory and now, we don't have whiteness, or, now we don't have racism and things like that. Everyone's anti-racist. It's deeply looking into, because critical theory is so interconnected with all of the, as Neil Shinver, Pat Sawyer would say, the contemporary critical social theories. And so we're looking at queer, we're looking at feminists, we're looking at children as oppressed categories, or the disabled, or, it's an entire societal revolution. And what people are really saying as they adopt critical theory, even in the churches, is that all of these systems and structures are beyond repair. And so revolution is the only thing that's left to be able to fix or repair our society.
And what they don't realize is that every time such a revolution or anything resembling such a revolution occurred, is that the revolutionaries inevitably start eating each other.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. The French Revolution, by the way, killed 250,000 Frenchmen, not including those who died in foreign wars.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
we
revolutionaries killed 250,000 of their fellow citizens
mhm.
in the name of liberation of the French.
Yes. And, sadly, I don't think people actually look back at history and even ask the question of why. Like, why did the revolutionaries need to kill their own people?
Because they didn't like the revolution.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the second area that we can note. Let's go to a third. Let's look at, well, I'll give you two more. A second, one of them is out of control spending on the part of the government. Deficit spending, massive deficit spending, has caused the collapse of every major power in history. Every great power in history has gone down because of out of control deficits. We can see this in Spain. With the Spanish Empire was the first global empire. It was the richest empire the world had ever seen. It collapsed because of out of control spending. We can see this with France. The entire revolution in France was actually triggered by a fiscal crisis.
Hmm.
We can see this over and over again. And I like France and Spain as your two examples, because they give you the two possibilities of the results of this. You can either, with all due respect, you can either turn into a social, political, and economic backwater like Spain did from being a global superpower, or you can get blood in the streets like France did. Those seem to be your two main choices. Britain had a relatively soft landing, but they had a really rough patch, and it's not entirely sure how that's going to end up because it's only been 50 or 60 years. But Russia, you have a revolution there. I mean, it's place after place. There are real problems when you have this kind of massive deficit spending. Rome is another example where there was a crisis with deficits. They end up devaluing their currency. They do that, by the way, by decreasing the amount of silver in their coins, literally debasing the currency. Things like that. I mean, it happens over and over again. When you have a great power, they always tend to bite off more than they can chew. They end up promising more than they can deliver. They end up getting involved in various kinds of foreign adventures that don't really do much for the country, and they outspend their income and fall into greater and greater debt. And once you get to a point where you're spending on interest to service the debt crosses a certain threshold of federal or national funds, you cannot get out of it. It puts you into a spiral where your fiscal collapse is inevitable.
Okay. So what I've heard so far is the first one is that when there's a belief that society is not fixable, that's one of the ways that we can see we're going into a decline. When you brought up critical theory and this oppressed oppressor mindset, what originally came to me was just this division of man. When we allow society to divide us into our separate social categories, we then become not just unable to be united, but there is something so starkly distinct between us that it will lead to the killing of others, because your dignity, value, and worth no longer has any meaning to me because I see you as fundamentally different than me. And then economic deficit and mass government spending, when we see societies go into this mass spending, or when we see a civilization that has a strong economic downturn, or they're definitely spending more than maybe what they are producing.
Yeah,
Is that fair?
yeah, that's a sign of national or imperial collapse, is the way I would describe that. That's not necessarily civilizational,
Okay.
but if you are, for example, Rome, where you are the civilization, it
Yeah.
is civilizational collapse. Um, you also, by the way, don't forget the sexual mores as well.
Yes.
That's on the list. The last one I would mention is unchecked immigration from regions or countries or people groups that are incompatible with you culturally. You can absorb a great number of people who are willing to nationalize, who are willing to adopt the culture and values of the country that they are entering. It is possible to absorb a tremendous number of people that way. As a matter of fact, the United States has done that. But when the people who are coming in hold values and have a culture that is fundamentally antithetical or hostile to your own, who are not interested in assimilating, who want to maintain their own identity against the identity of the country that they're entering, when you have large numbers of people who do that, you are creating a situation where national collapse is, or in case of Rome, civilizational collapse also ends up being inevitable. In the case of Rome, we talk about the barbarian invasions. What we aren't really dealing with, for the most part, are invasions in the usual sense of the word. Mostly what we're dealing with is migration. Rome, for centuries, had been sending out propaganda that said Rome is this highly civilized place. It's highly stable. We've got this great economy. We've got this great culture. We offer all of these wonderful things. We're stable. We're safe. All of these kinds of things were happening. Well, then what happened is, for a variety of reasons, you have large numbers of people who begin moving. Entire tribes begin migrating. Part of it is climate change. Things are getting colder and wetter, so people up north can't grow crops anymore because the growing season gets too short. You've got tribes who are bumping into each other. They're jostling each other, and so they're pushing each other out of the way. And so you start getting large numbers of people that say, you know what? Things aren't good here. Let's go to Rome. Rome is safe. Rome is secure. We can make a living in Rome. And so Rome attracted lots of people moving across the borders to get the benefits of Roman society. Only they weren't Romans, and they weren't Romanized, and they weren't interested in necessarily becoming Roman. They wanted to continue being Goths or Franks or Alemanni or whatever. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different tribes that are doing this. They wanted to maintain their own culture and things like that, but also to gain the benefits of Rome. And the effect of this, many of them joined the army. So the Roman army, as I mentioned before, becomes a Germanic institution. As a matter of fact, the military commanders of Rome, starting in the late 300s or early 400s, the military commanders, the head of the Roman military were Germans, things like that. And, gradually the culture of Rome starts, the things that made Rome Rome are no longer there anymore. And so eventually the Germans realize they don't really need the Romans. And Roman authority in the West, Roman systems in the West collapse. And they're replaced by what are known as barbarian successor states. You get the Visigoths in Spain, you get the Franks in modern day France, you get the Ostrogoths in Italy, later the Lombards, you get, on and on and on. But it occurred because of migration, people coming in wanting to receive the benefits of Rome, but to maintain their own culture.
Yes, and that's a current conversation, that Krista and I are always in is, what do you do with migration or assimilation or, immigration? How are we going to, and just using our, context here in America, how do we keep our unique American culture and not just have everyone come in with their differing worldviews, differing cultures, many of which can be hostile toward our culture here. And I haven't always appreciated this idea, but the more conversations I have, the more I'm beginning to see like, oh yeah, like we have something to protect here. And if we are just caring for or bringing in everyone with ideas that don't align with our values here in America, that don't align with a Christian worldview, or that are hostile to the West, hostile to our God. What does that do for our nation? And I
When,
know
when
we're talking about civilization, but I do agree with you, like just looking at America as, our nation.
Well, when you have people on college campuses who are here on student visas chanting death to America, what do you do with that?
I say you put them out, but that's just me.
Okay, yeah, I mean, but that's exactly the question that we're asking here.
It is.
Um, here's the thing. Remember where I started on civilization? It's a relatively complex structure, but what holds it together is a set of agreed upon norms and values, and there's this sort of common cultural element. There can be diversity within it, but there's a common cultural element that is agreed upon that makes the
Yes.
civilization what it is.
Yeah.
If you look at a nation, it's something that's similar. Originally, nation, biblical word. If you want the Greek word, it's ethnos. If you want Hebrew, it's goy. Okay. And what that originally meant is a combination of what we would think of as a nation or a kingdom, but that was also associated with a specific ethnic group, but also a specific culture. They were relatively homogenous linguistically, ethnically, culturally, religiously, all of those kinds of things. In the modern world, that's less true. In the modern world, a nation is really defined primarily by culture, language, culture, those kinds of things. We tend to be religiously diverse, but there has to be a common set of values, a common set of norms that people agree upon. And with that, I would argue even things like a common set of civic rituals and stuff like that that people hold in common. Those are the things that they're the glue that holds the nation together. And if you break those things down, there is no longer anything holding the nation together, and it will inevitably pull itself apart. So if you, I mean, that it seems to me is just common sense. So if you have this kind of unchecked, unassimilated immigration, or immigration that is done without any kind of expectation of assimilation, or without any desire to assimilate, what you are doing is you are bringing in the seeds of the dissolution of the nation. it's an inevitability if you do it on a large enough scale, because there is nothing left to hold the thing together.
Preach on, Dr. Sunshine, preach on.
I mean,
Yes.
this is not a biblical argument or anything. This is common sense.
But common sense isn't common.
Well, yeah, there is that problem.
There is. And I do think that we can perhaps, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but extrapolate biblical principles from what you're saying. When I think about the nation of Israel, the foreigners that came into Israel had expectations.
Right. And that's
So yes, you weren't, it wasn't just this idea of, well, you just come on and, you were an Ammonite, you just come on into Israel and you can be, no, that wasn't the expectation. They were expected to worship Yahweh. Look at Naomi and Ruth.
okay.
When Ruth wanted to go with Naomi, she said, I'm going to make your God my God.
Yeah. Now, when you look at Israel, when you look at the laws, there are basically two classes of foreigners in Israel. There are some who are there temporarily. They're merchants, they're travelers, things like that. There aren't a lot of expectations on them. But when you look at the sojourner, a sojourner is a foreigner who is coming and who is living there.
Yes.
And what's interesting about the sojourners were to be treated well. They were to be treated like pretty much like the Israelites. Okay. But there were reciprocal expectations of the sojourners. The sojourners were to abide by the Sabbath laws. They were there was a whole slew of things that they were supposed to do, but there were certain things they were not allowed to do. They were not to celebrate the Passover. Things like that, unless they were circumcised, unless they took citizenship, unless they actively joined the community. But there were a set of expectations, norms that they were supposed to do, that they were required to do. They were required to, well, to a degree, to assimilate into the people of Israel, to accept the minimal standards that it took to function within the community and not to disrupt it. They didn't have to go all the way, but they had to at least do this much. So the thing that shows up or that doesn't show up in most of the treatments of the discussions of treatment of foreigners, we're supposed to welcome the foreigners, all of these kinds of things. They never talk about the expectations of the foreigners to the host country.
Yeah.
People never do that. And yet that's clear in scripture when you read the laws about sojourners.
I could stay on this point for a very long time, but we have to keep going.
Get up on the sidewalk, please. Demonstrators clashing with George Floyd, parts of the
now turning deadly. Anger.
What does it mean to be a Christ follower in this cultural moment and have biblically centered conversations on race, justice, and unity? I wanted to ask, because you brought up the idea of institutions, I want to look forward and look at our current society and our modern institutions, our government, our media, our schools. How do you see them contributing to a decline of our nation or civilization?
Well, I would argue that there's been a significant ideological capture in many of these institutions, in the public schools, in the media, in law schools, and therefore in the field of law and in government, where a number of very unhelpful ideological perspectives really hold sway. Critical theory, I think it's past its prime, but it has embedded itself deeply in many of these institutions. And there's a generation who's been maybe more than a generation by now that's been pretty thoroughly indoctrinated into it, so that it's whether or not they consciously accept all of the premises of it, a lot of the basic assumptions of it have been deeply embedded in their thinking.
Mhm.
And this through the institutions, through media, through the education, and so on. And that bodes ill um, for the future in a lot of ways. Um, a lot of the things that I've described as signs of civilization or national decline are well underway in the United States, and they're
Yeah.
even worse in Europe.
So when we're thinking of the institutions, I'm glad that you brought up education, and even, like law, because a lot of that starts like in their classrooms and in their universities. When I think of something like critical theory that questions objective truth, or when we see postmodernism and ideas of moral relativism and things like that, what are the actual consequences of that on our culture?
Well, it creates a situation. Well, first of all, no one really believes there's no such thing as objective truth.
Well,
They claim they do, but they always believe their truth is objective. It is objectively true that there is no objective truth. You know,
preach on.
it is objectively true that racism is a fundamental problem in American society. It's fundamentally true that whites are inevitably racist. It is fundamentally true that men hate women. Whatever. These are objective truths, although there are no objective truths. I mean, it's really rather silly. It's a self-defeating argument. I mean, but the problem that comes from that is that people have these ideas in place that make it, well, there are a couple of problems. One of them is it makes it really difficult to actually solve anything. It makes it difficult to really deal with problems when they come up. So let me give you a concrete example here. Um, I have argued for years that the tendency to blame everything on white men is a formula for creating white racists.
Mhm.
And so, what do you see happening now?
Yep.
You see Andrew Tate becoming a very popular and influential figure, even in Christian schools,
Hmm.
um, because of the backlash against this.
Yeah.
If you keep telling white boys they are the problem, they may believe you. And if they believe you, they may become the problem.
I would
Um,
even go as far as to say that when they hear it so much, they just don't care anymore.
or they
It's
don't care
You
anymore.
know what I mean? It's like you're gonna say this about me anyway, so now I'm just gonna live into it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Or what happens is you get a backlash against it in the form of white nationalism,
Mhm.
and that may even take the form of white Christian nationalism. These are, people don't realize it, but these are the direct consequences of the ideological push of critical theory.
Yes, which I would say is the exact same issue when we don't criticize organizations or movements like Black Lives Matter, or the push for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and all of these things. It's the same error on the point. It's just the opposite side.
Yeah. Yeah, what will end up happening is the critical theorist will say, "See, this is the problem we've been pointing to all along," when actually they created it.
Yeah. In your estimation, are we the West, and I want to open it up to the West, not just, our microcosm of America, but are we in decline? Would you say we are actually in real time watching the fall of the civilization of the West?
Um, I will preface this by saying that as a historian, I'm much better at things that have already happened. But I think that the answer is yes. I think that the Western civilization is very definitely in decline. I think Europe is pretty far gone. Europe right now is, let me rephrase this. The elites that are running Europe are very, very much, well, they're fundamentally technocrats. Um, and all right, well, here, let me give you another sort of broad theoretical framework here. Political systems parallel economic systems because both of them are based on what you consider to be the proper organization of human relations. Republican systems go with free market economics because in both cases, it's based on you have a choice of what you are going to support. Technocratic systems go with socialist systems because in both cases, you believe that the experts are the ones who should make the decisions. Europe is very much a technocratic society, which is why they tend to go with leftist economic policies, centralization, all of those kinds of things. So you have a situation in Europe where you have a technocratic elite who, in their belief is that open borders are the right thing, and you are creating a rather odd alliance. Britain is the case, your best case in point here. You're creating a rather odd alliance between the left and Islamists. This is exactly the alliance that brought Khomeini to power in Iran. And once the Islamists took over, they promptly killed all the leftists. We're looking at Europe in the process, the elites at least, are in the process of attempting civilizational suicide, but they don't know it. Now, the populists in Europe, which is probably the majority of the population, although it's a little unclear, the populists in Europe are trying to make a stand against this. But when you have the elites in Europe canceling elections, banning political parties and candidates and so on, it's a little unclear how that's going to work out. Civil war is not unlikely. Okay. Now, in America, we've got a different set of problems. We have an extraordinarily divided country, roughly 50-50. But 50% of that country, the Democrats, half of them think that political assassination is justified. And a number of them are actually thinking that what we need is a flat-out revolution a la France in 1789. So we're in a situation where there is actually a reasonably strong contingent that are thinking in terms of revolution, though whether they actually will attempt it is a different matter. But we have already had a few assassination attempts.
Yeah.
I grew up in the 60s. I grew up thinking that political assassination was sort of normal. Okay. I remember JFK. I remember RFK. I remember Martin Luther King. I remember the attempt on Wallace. I remember all of these things. This just sort of seemed like every few years somebody gets shot. That was me growing up. I don't hope we don't return to that, but because if we do, it's going to be a lot uglier even than the 60s.
Yeah.
But the problem is, though, that that's on the left. On the right, it's not clear to me that we don't have some sort of the Trump movement. I like a lot of the things that Trump is trying to do. I think he's doing them in a rather ham-fisted way, but I like a lot of what he's trying to do. But what concerns me is there's a real sense of Trump emerging as almost a strong man. There's almost a cult of personality surrounding him in many circles. And
can you say more to that?
Well, if you do not 100% back everything that Trump is doing, you're disloyal, you're whatever, and suddenly, you're a quisling, you're a traitor, you're whatever.
Yeah.
I see that kind of rhetoric, and that worries me, because you shouldn't have to march lockstep behind a leader. And like I said, in general, I think Trump is doing a lot of the right things. I don't think
Yeah.
he's doing all the right things. And some of the right things he's doing, like I said, I think are kind of ham-fisted. But I worry about, this worry is too strong a word, but I am alert to the danger of a cult of personality built around the guy. So I think we're in a rather unstable and dangerous spot right now here. I don't think we're as far gone and in as much danger as Europe. And I think what Trump does is buy us some time to try to shore up a number of things. I think a lot of what he is doing will make it much harder for us to go the direction of Europe. But there are dangers on the other side as well.
Yes, I've heard it. I think a couple years ago, I was in a conversation with someone, and they described it as, you know, the idea that totalitarianism doesn't care who brings in totalitarianism, whether it comes
Mhm.
on the left or whether it comes on the right. Um, and as you're describing some of your concerns, even on the right, it makes me think back to that comment when I heard it. And I'm not exactly sure if that's your concern, you know, explicitly or just simply, what does this cultish kind of um air around him, or that can be generated from some of the things that he's doing, or the ideas, the no enemies to the right and things like that, that can actually come up when you have someone who is trying to stave off, a revolution, who's trying to stave off some of the horrible, political things that we're seeing in Europe. And yet, you know, like you said, it may not be doing everything correctly, but then this mindset also trickles down into other politicians, but then eventually just into the broader culture that's on the right.
Yeah. The positive thing I see is that his work at dismantling the government, the Doge stuff, and all of that
Mhm.
is going to make it really hard for anybody to pull off the kind of totalitarianism we're talking about. What
Yeah.
I find absolutely bizarre is anybody who talks about Musk as a fascist, because fascists build government power, they don't dismantle it. And Trump being behind this and really wanting to take out the government bureaucracy, that's extraordinary, actually, and
Mhm.
it's really hard to see that as a totalitarian impulse. So there is that, but the cult of personality is a bit concerning.
As we wrap, let me ask you some questions about the church and how you see the church's participation in our current cultural moment. How do you see the church responding? Like, are you like, well, they're doing the best they can. They're doing pretty well. Or are you like, man, we're missing it and we could step up in so many other areas?
Okay, I'm going to answer this two ways. First of all,
Okay.
there are people out there who are saying things like, "We need a revival of Christianity to save Western civilization." I'm hearing this from people even who are atheists. And my answer to that is absolutely not, because you cannot use God for your purposes. You cannot use God to do something for something else.
Hmm.
You have to pursue God for his own sake, not for the sake of something else. God can't be used to do what you want him to do. That is essentially the problem with the prosperity gospel. You're using God as a means to an end.
Mm-hmm.
You can't use God as a means to save Western civilization. You need to
Like we could
pursue.
have a revolution, and I mean a revival in America, and yet we could still see the decline, or we could have a revival in the West and we could still see the collapse of the civilization.
Yeah, yeah. The point is, we need to pursue the kingdom of God.
Mhm.
And we need to pursue the kingdom of God for the kingdom of God's sake. We need to pursue Christ for Christ's sake. We need to pursue God for God's sake. And if we do this, it may have as a secondary effect saving Western civilization. It may or it may not. But our focus has to be on building the kingdom. Now, because so much of Western civilization was built around kingdom values, frankly. The idea of limited government really comes from St. Augustine and his understanding of original sin. The idea of checks and balances in government follows from that. The idea of fundamental rights, human rights, comes from Christianity. All of these things. And if you lose Christianity, you lose all the things that depend on Christianity. If you recover Christianity, maybe you recover, well, hopefully you recover these things with it. So it may be that if we work to build the kingdom, if we do the things we're supposed to do, it may be that we'll save Western civilization. Maybe not. But even if we don't save Western civilization, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing. We're building the kingdom. And maybe something will replace it. When Rome fell, the Christians could not conceive of anything possibly coming after it. They had no idea what this would look like because the only thing that they knew was Rome. And what came after it was a pretty rough patch, but what emerged out of it was a civilization that was more Christian than Rome ever was. And it may be that that's what God's got in store for us. Maybe not, but it may be that's what he's got in store for us. Or it may be 18th century Britain was an absolute, let's put Britain in perspective. In the middle of the 18th century, 25% of the unmarried women in London were prostitutes. It was that corrupt.
Wow.
Wilberforce, the Clapham sect, and people like that not only worked to abolish the slave trade, but they also worked on what Wilberforce called the Reformation of manners. And the effect of this was a complete transformation of British culture, where suddenly things like human rights, the value of the individual, respect for the dignity of the poor, things like that, became cultural norms. It was said of Wilberforce that he made goodness fashionable. And the entire society was transformed. Maybe that's what God's got in store for us if we do our jobs. Maybe not.
Yeah.
We don't know. But
Yeah.
the important thing is that we do our jobs. That we work for the kingdom, that we work to live out a full-fledged biblical worldview, which I define simply as understanding what the Lordship of Christ means in every area of life. That we live this out, that we promote it in every way we can out of love of neighbor. Because if we believe God's ways are truly best, then out of love for neighbor, we need to promote God's ways out of love of neighbor because they will produce the best results for our neighbor. If we do those things and leave the results in God's hands, we're doing what we're called to do.
All right. I think that's a good place to end it. That we would go out, and what I hear you saying is that we would actually live according to the scripture, that we would live according to the kingdom, that as we live out the mandates that we see in scripture for believers, we will have an impact on culture. And we trust God with our nation. We trust God with our civilization. We trust God with life. And we don't create or pray for revival so that our nation is saved. We pray for God's will to be done, that that others would know him and live for him, and that as a byproduct of that, our civilization would be changed. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with praying for the nation. But,
No, yeah, I hear you. I hear that part. No.
but at the same point, we don't try to build the kingdom to save the nation.
Yes.
We build the kingdom for the sake of the kingdom.
Yes.
That's the key point here.
Thank you. Please tell our viewers about your work. Where can we follow you at? I know that we have your website address where people can follow you at every square inch, or where you are equipping the saints, as it says on your website. Tell us about your work and make sure that people are able to stay in contact.
Yeah, so the website, as you see there, is esquareinch.org or esquareinch.com. Either one works. I also am on a weekly podcast called the Theology Pugcast. That's P-U-G cast. So named because we were originally meeting together in a pub called the Corner Pug. So we called it the Pugcast. I meet with C.R. Wiley and Tom Price, and we have various guests coming in at different times and so on. So the podcast is a good place to keep up with some of the things I'm doing. And I write for Breakpoint a couple of times a month. I blog. I've got a Patreon where I've got a number of courses that are put up there. And you can find me on both Facebook and X.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having this conversation. This has been such a good conversation. I have taken notes. Like, I am like, this is like a college course. Like, I need to know all the things that I don't know. And so, thank you so much for teaching me and for equipping our listeners. We are very grateful. I will talk with you again soon.
Well, thanks for having me on, Monique. It was a lot of fun.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You guys, I don't know about you, but that conversation was so helpful. I have thought about the decline of a society or of a civilization, but I haven't gone into it in the way in which Dr. Sunshine went into it and like these 5 points and all of that. I hope that this conversation was helpful to you as well. We'll make sure to put the 5 points of a declining society or a declining civilization in our show notes so you can see those things. But just think about America in real time and think of some of the things that he mentioned. You the unmooring of our sexual mores. Think about this division of man that comes along with critical theory. All of these things we are seeing happen in real time. Think about the way that our economy or the government was spending our money or has been spending our money historically, and the deficit that we've been running and all of that. There are so many things or so many parallels from a society or a civilization like Rome then and a civilization like America today. And so, yes, I definitely believe that we should be praying for our nation. We should definitely, as Christians, marry and procreate. We should definitely be, Matthew 28:19ing things, going out and spreading the hope of the gospel and creating disciples, teaching them in the ways that Jesus has taught us and that the way that the scriptures teach us. This is how we impact society. And so, with that, I encourage you, go out, share the good news of the kingdom, make an impact, not so that our civilization is changed, but so that hearts are changed, and that changed hearts then go out and change society. I will see you next week. Bye.
There's nothing left.